When it comes to your retirement, do you want to have the same old plan everyone else has? Of course not. You're unique and have your own goals and dreams. Don't be treated just like a number. This is your retirement. So it's time to think differently. And you're in luck because you've found the Retire Your Way podcast with ILG Financial. At ILG Financial, you won't find generic, run-of-the-mill plans containing the same old cookie-cutter solutions. Dave, Chase, and the ILG Financial team focus on building one retirement at a time using their Think Differently philosophy. And that means your own comprehensive plan with customized solutions built to achieve just one goal, yours. So put on your Think Differently hats and get ready to take back control of your retirement today and for all the tomorrows to come. ILG Financial's Retire Your Way podcast was created just for you, and it's starting right now.
Welcome to another edition of the Retire Your Way podcast with Dave Lopez. I'm Ron Stutz on the Retire Your Way podcast. Dave, of course, is the founder of ILG Financial, his office in Stafford, Virginia, and you can find him online at ilgfinancial.com. And we're going to talk about a lot of interesting things here today on the podcast. Dave, how are you, my friend?
Doing great. Sure good to be back with you. I know Chase has done, I think Chase did the last podcast, so yeah. I'm a little jealous. I didn't get to spend some time with you, so I'm back in the saddle.
Well, I enjoy talking to Chase as well, and glad you're back today because I've missed you.
That sounds very political.
Not really. We talk a lot about planning finances on this podcast, but something that can get lost sometimes in all of that planning is the idea that life events are something that we cannot always expect. Mm-hmm. Some things are going to come out of the blue, but those things still need to be addressed. Today, Dave Lopez is here to talk about Medicaid, but more specifically, how Medicaid comes into play when you or a spouse have to move into a nursing home, and how the rules can be all over the map, really. So it's not really a cut and dry situation, is it, Dave?
It is definitely not cut and dry. You couldn't have articulated that better, Ron. So, and one of the challenges we see when we meet with clients and this conversation, this topic comes up, is that most don't fully understand until they're dealing with it, a Medicaid situation or a long-term care situation or going into a nursing home. Yeah. It's only at that point where for many people, it's the first time they're looking at this, and they don't understand the rules for Medicaid coverage with respect to nursing home care. They don't get how very complicated they can be. These rules contain many traps, for lack of a better word. So what I'd like to do today is, for the sake of today's discussion, let's just look through the lens of a specific situation. And that situation we see all the time. And it would be a married couple. Mm-hmm. And one of the married couple, let's keep it easy. Let's just say the wife gets to the point where she needs to go into a nursing home.
Okay.
We'll call, in this case, the spouse, we'll call the husband. But the husband does not need to go into the nursing home, and he either doesn't want to go, he wants to stay in the house, or he can't afford to go into the nursing home. So either of those situations, we've got the wife going into the nursing home, we've got the husband not going into the nursing home. So we'll use that situation to talk about how Medicaid could work for somebody who's going to need that type of coverage.
I know that's a situation that a lot of people don't really understand, as you mentioned. So first here, before we really get started, why don't you do a quick refresher on what Medicaid is, who uses it, and how Medicaid works?
Sure. So Medicaid, people get that confused all the time with Medicare, mm-hmm. right? Remember, Medicare is the social health care system for folks 65 and up. And once you hit 65, you qualify for Medicare. Most of it is free. You pay a little bit on your Social Security for Part B of Medicare, right? But the other parts are, for the most part, free. You pay a little bit for prescription drug. Mm-hmm. That's Medicare. Medicaid is completely different. Think of that as true socialized medicine. It is free for those who can't afford it. So you have to meet certain requirements. You have to have a low income and things like that. If you have low income, just like you would qualify for welfare, you could qualify for Medicaid. Mm-hmm. Now, the limits are different than welfare, but it is a health insurance program at no cost. And it applies, and it's very interesting and important in this discussion because we're specifically discussing nursing home care. Medicaid covers those under 65, and it even covers those over 65 who are eligible and on Medicare.
Okay, so let's get into this whole situation of the spouse in a nursing home. One person has to go there. How does all that work? How does Medicaid help?
All right, so remember, unlike most health insurance, Medicaid pays for nursing home care. Right. Medicare doesn't. It pays for just a very short period of time if you need some care. Other health insurances may not pay for any time if you need some care. But Medicaid does pay for nursing home care. So that's why folks who are already 65 and on Medicare might still need Medicaid. So to qualify for the nursing home care coverage, the wife in this example, right, the nursing home resident, has to prove that she's impoverished under Medicaid's rules. And the rules can be very complicated because they differ from state to state. Medicaid think of it as a pseudo-state federal program. So the qualifications are really different in every state. In most states, this is a good average, in order to be eligible to go into a nursing home, the person going in, the wife in this case, has to have less than about $2,000 in what we call countable assets.
Right.
Okay. And about all the assets you could think of, anything they have is considered a countable asset against this limit, with the exception of their home. Okay. And that's limited, depending on the state, between $600,000 and $900,000 of the home wouldn't count towards the countable assets.
Okay. All right. So, that whole situation is a little bit complicated already here. And what about if the nursing home resident is married, their spouse is known as the community spouse? Is that true?
You got it. That's right. So remember, imagine somebody was single and they needed to qualify for Medicaid. They basically said, look, you don't get Medicaid unless you've got less than $2,000 in assets. Right. And we'll talk a little bit about how if you had more, what you would do. Well, then the question is, what if you're married, right? Does the husband have to lose all his assets in this example? So this is called the community spouse, the person who's not going into the facility. The community spouse, Ron, can keep more than $2,000, and there's a limit to how much that person can keep. And it's about 137 to, I think in Virginia, it's about 148. Don't quote me on that, but we'll talk about where you can get the exact numbers. So if you're not going into it, the community spouse could keep some assets too.
Well, thank goodness for that.
Yeah. And if you're looking that up, and again, we'll have a link at the bottom where you can look for specific numbers for each state. Medicaid would call that the community spouse resource allowance. Well, C, S as in Sam, R as in Robert, A as in Apple. That's the amount the spouse can keep. So the person going in can keep about $2,000. The person not going in can keep, maybe about $140,000 roughly.
Okay. Well, before we get really deep into the weeds on all this stuff, let me jump in here with your phone number so that folks might be able to arrange a time to come and talk with you about all of this kind of stuff, because it can get rather complicated. 540-720-5656. 540-720-5656. That is a number for Dave Lopez, Chase Lopez, and all the folks at ILG Financial. And, of course, it's ilgfinancial.com. We're talking about Medicaid on today's show. And, Dave, there are folks I've heard talk about, spending down their assets. And how does that whole process work when it comes to Medicaid?
Yeah, so remember, think big picture. So remember, what we just said was you couldn't qualify for Medicaid unless you had less than $2,000 in assets, and if you're married, your spouse has to have no more than roughly $140,000 in assets. So what do you do if you have more than that? That's what they mean by spend down. So what you want to do is use the money up so that you can get down to those limits. So then now you qualify. Until you get down to those limits, you don't get Medicaid. You just have to pay with your money, right? So one obvious way to spend it down would be you just use the money for pay the nursing home yourself out of pocket. And once your value of your assets, your countable assets get low enough, then Medicaid would start paying instead of you.
Yeah.
Now, many people want to avoid that scenario, right?
Sure.
Because you'd like to somehow retain your money. So what people do is they try to spend it on other stuff that eventually, you could retain. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a whole different mindset that it requires to try and spend down your money from what people have been accustomed to all their lives.
That's exactly right. So you're actually looking for things you could spend on that would now not be counted against you in Medicaid. So that spending can be anything from benefits for the spouse, right? You can pay off debt, pay down mortgage. You can pay a line of credits off on the house. You can spend the money to fix your house up, right? Remember we said the house was excluded to a certain amount?
Yeah.
Right? You could buy a car, or you could even take a vacation, right? That's the idea. I'd rather use this money for myself than just give it to the nursing home, because the sooner I get rid of it, the sooner Medicaid pays anyway. Yeah, the one thing you cannot do, and this is the big caveat, Ron, you can't just give it away to your heirs.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a penalty if you do it the wrong way. There's a look back period. I think now it's like 5 years they look back.
Yeah.
So you can't just give the money to your children and say, look, I don't have the money. They're going to look back 5 years. And if you gave anything back to anybody in that 5 years, they'll just say, look, until you come up with this money, you don't get on Medicaid.
Wow.
And you don't have to go back to your kids and get the money, but you just don't get on Medicaid. And here's the trick to this. And this, I actually spoke to somebody in law enforcement and said, they've been going through a lot of going after fraud because of all the COVID fraud that was going on.
Sure.
But it surprised me when they said, interestingly, they're going after a lot of Medicaid fraud. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And they said, well, a lot of folks are doing this spend down. They're giving the money to their kids, which you're allowed to do, right? Yeah. And they get past the 5-year window and they think they're okay. But then what the law enforcement does is they'll watch. They know where the money is. It'll be in accounts. Let's say it's in your son's name in an account, Ron.
Okay.
And if they see you going to the ATM, pulling money out, and of course that's on video, right? Yeah. Then what they say is, look, you have access to that account, which means you didn't give up access to that money. That's your money.
Oh, wow.
Now, it gets worse. Guess who they go after for that?
They go after your son?
You bet. And the reason is you don't have any money. You're on Medicaid, right?
Yeah, sure.
So, remember at that point, you're sick and you're in a facility. So what would you say? Come after me. What are you going to do? Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So if they want to make this a real deterrent, they go after the child, because what they say, the child was complicit in Medicaid fraud, right? They pretended to take control of the money and then allowed you to have access to the money. Mm-hmm. Right? Wow. So the point is, you can give the money away to anybody, and the 5-year rule does work. But please understand, if you do that, be prepared that you truly gave it away. You cannot have an ATM card. You cannot not have access to that money. If you need some money, your heirs are free to give you some, but you better have a real clear and be very clear on how it's given back, so it's clear that you do not have control in any way of that money.
Okay, so if you do this would cause a penalty of a period of ineligibility for Medicaid, but what about some exceptions? Are there exceptions to this?
Yeah, always exceptions. So one that jumps off the page that we say is, for example, you could transfer money to someone, in this case, let's say it's a child, for the sole benefit of that person's care if they're disabled.
Okay. All right.
Right? So you could set up a trust, we call it a special needs trust. So to help that person throughout their life because they're disabled, and that money you could give away and it wouldn't count against you with the spend down.
Well, this whole thing sounds kind of scary, really, and it just emphasizes the fact that it's so important to do this thing right. Do I have to spend all of my assets down before Medicaid will pay anything at all? I mean, how do you let them know? How does that start, the paying for your spouse's nursing home?
Yeah, so if you're going this route, trying to spend the money down, obviously the sooner you spend the money down to the limits where you qualify for Medicaid,
right, the
sooner Medicaid's going to start paying the bill instead of you paying the bill, right? So spending down earlier rather than later, and even starting before the person's ill sometimes, if you're trying to plan this in advance, is something that many people consider.
Okay. Interesting. So what does it look like when a couple is trying to do all this strategically, But while they're waiting for Medicaid to be approved or kick in, they can't afford to pay out of pocket for the nursing home.
Yeah, so this is a tricky one. So, of course, if you have assets, you're just going to use those assets to pay for it, right?
Yeah.
But it can be difficult even to get into a nursing home, right? If the nursing home doesn't feel like you have enough assets to pay for yourself, and you haven't been approved for Medicaid yet. Because remember, on the nursing home side, there's no guarantee you're going to get approved.
Right.
And if you don't have the money and Medicaid doesn't approve you, they don't get any money.
This is also tricky. It really is. Now, in most cases, the patient cannot apply for Medicaid benefits until they move into a nursing home. But the nursing home doesn't want to be left high and dry if the resident's application gets rejected for one reason or another. That's just really a tangled web we weave there.
It is, and that's why we'll talk a little bit about this at the end. This is not the way, if there's any other way to do it. This spend down thing, there's other ways I would recommend that you do this, right?
Okay.
But I'm not a big fan of this method because, like you said, it is just a mess. And again, remember, the end game here is to lose all of your assets so you can get on Medicaid.
Yeah.
Well, the downside to that is you've lost all your assets.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So if you have assets and you don't want to lose them, we'll talk just a minute when we're done about probably the way I would recommend you do it instead of worrying about this spend down mess.
All of this just emphasizes the fact that you really need a professional in the financial world to help you through all this. It's kind of hard to do it on your own.
It is, and it's, in my opinion, unnecessarily complicated, as most things where the government's involved are. But that's the world we live in, right? So knowing that, just like taxes, right? Knowing that, just know that's the world we're in. And as a result, you want to involve somebody who's well-versed in this stuff to help you build out a plan that works best for you because there's so many options.
So how should the folks listening go about assessing their situation and their qualifications and all of that stuff when it comes to this type of situation with Medicaid?
Well, the first thing I would do is get with a financial professional and let them take inventory of everything you have.
All right.
And the situation. And then you can kind of first discuss if you want to go through a spend down program. And then together what we would do with a client is work on exactly how we're going to do the spend down program to get you involved and how we're going to deal with if one of you needs a facility immediately, how we're going to deal with that in the interim, right? If no one needs a facility yet, but you're just determined to use the spend down method, then again, we would work together to see what's the best way to spend the money down to the limits that are required for the state you're in. Mm-hmm. So that if you did need Medicaid, if you did need nursing home care, Medicaid would pay for it.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, this probably is the takeaway I would have, Ron.
Okay.
That's not how I would recommend folks do it.
Yeah,
for the reasons I mentioned.
I'm
right?
looking forward to hearing what you say you would recommend because all of this other stuff sounds kind of scary, really.
Yeah. So remember, the reason this stuff is so confusing is the purpose of Medicaid is for folks who truly have no assets.
Yeah.
Not for folks who have assets, but they're trying to hide or protect them so they can get on Medicaid. That's why this stuff's so complicated. The government wants to make it difficult for you, if you have assets, to not use your money, your own money for long-term care.
Yeah.
Right? And then if you do, what they'll say is, look, that's fine. Use it. When it's done, we'll take care of you. But you have to use your money first.
Yeah.
So the real question shouldn't be, how do I get rid of my money so I can get on Medicaid? In my opinion, the real question should be, how do I best cover long-term care expenses so that I have a chance of protecting assets for either me to use in retirement, even when I'm in a nursing home, and or pass them to the people I love and still be able to cover care.
Yeah.
Right.
Most of us wouldn't have any idea how to start with all of that.
Right. And the easiest way to do that is, if you have quite a few assets, is we just petition part of your assets aside to use for long-term care. Right. So if you need it, you use it, and that protects your other assets. If you don't need it, your heirs inherit it. And the best way to do that, it's different for everybody, of course, but a great way to consider doing that is investment strategies using what they call asset-based long-term care. And we've talked about these in previous podcasts. But you can go back and find that podcast or call the office. We'll turn you on to it, or just come in and talk to us and we'll talk to you about it. It allows you to take, part of your savings, just like you would in an IRA, and just set it aside for long-term care. But the return, the tax-free money you get to use for long-term care is exponentially greater than what you've set aside.
Wow.
Right. So imagine putting $100,000 aside for long-term care. And if you needed it, it would give you up to $400,000 in long-term care tax-free.
Wow.
That's for an investment, that's a great return on investment, right?
That's terrific, yeah.
Right? But if you didn't need it, the kids would get, the $100,000 or maybe more when you died. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a no-lose, right? But the big advantage of that is if you do that, when we do this with all of our things, if you have a goal in retirement, in this case, the goal is to cover possible long-term care costs. Mm-hmm. What we want to do is what investment strategy, Ron, do we want to employ so that we use as little of your money as possible to attain your goal with as little risk as possible? Make sense?
Yeah, it certainly does, Dave.
Yeah, so in this case, that using this strategy, this asset-based long-term care strategy, is no risk in that the companies that hold the funds for you guarantee the $400,000 that you'll need. So you're not hoping the market does well, right? Or hoping your $100,000 grows to $400,000. You could set aside $100,000 for long-term care. God forbid the next day go get in a car accident and need long-term care. And you'd get $400,000 tax-free for long-term care.
Wow, that is amazing.
Right. But the important part is think of the big picture now. Let's say you've got other assets. Now we've only allocated, because of the way we've used this, you've only needed to set aside $100,000 for $400,000 of care.
Yeah.
Right. Well, if you had $500,000 saved, that frees up another $400,000 that you don't need to use for long-term care. You can use that for fun money and enjoying the kids and inflation hedge and, monthly bills and all the other stuff. That's the key.
Phenomenal, Dave. I appreciate your telling us all about this.
Yeah, that's the way to go. Now, in my opinion, the spend down stuff is intentionally confusing because they want to discourage you from trying to hide your money and do this. And it creates all these other kind of headaches. So when we usually talk to clients and we say, we're talking about Medicaid. Mm-hmm. This is really for folks who don't have the assets. So if you don't have it, or let's just say that we use the asset-based strategy we talked about, right, and you were in a facility for 15 years. So we used the $400,000 and then we used your other money up. Well, then it's nice to know there's still a safety net. Yes, your money's gone, but you're still taken care of. So your kids wouldn't have to pay for you on Medicaid. That's how I would build a plan out for most people.
That's how you're not a burden to your kids,
That's exactly right. You don't want to be a burden to your kids. And that asset-based strategy is the best way to take care of it for most people. It's different for everybody. But if you want to know if it's for you, just get on the website and click a link to ask us to reach out to you or call the number that you gave earlier. We'll sit down and we'll look at your stuff and I can give a specific recommendation, whether Medicaid spend down's right for you, whether investing using an asset-based strategy would work best for you, or whether there's a different way we would go.
Wow. Dave, you did such a great job explaining all that, and there's so much more to know, and it's so important for folks to get in touch with you and have a conversation about this. If this concerns you, if this whole explanation about Medicaid is a little confusing, a little complicated, as it is for me, trying to understand all this, remember that you can get in touch with Dave Lopez. You can have a longer conversation about this as it applies to your specific situation, and you'll know a whole lot more. You'll feel better about it. Why not reach out to Dave Lopez's office today? Hey, Dave, it's been a pleasure being with you, and I'm already looking forward to our next podcast.
Me too. Listen, I'll talk to you soon, Ron. Good talking to you. And I hope anyone listening to this, if you're concerned, pick up the phone and give us a call, get on the calendar, and we'll make you feel better. Income, legacy, growth, and information about Medicare and Medicaid. It's all right here at ILG Financial, and it's about helping you plan for retirement your way so you can achieve all of your financial goals. Call ILG Financial at 540-720-5656, or you can go online to ilgfinancial.com to learn more. This has been the Retire Your Way podcast with Dave Lopez. I'm Ron Stutz. Thanks for listening.
The information provided is for educational purposes only and is not intended as investment advice for any individual or entity. All information contained herein is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy. The views presented today are those of Dave Lopez and do not necessarily represent the views of the Alpha Star Capital Management, LLC. The opinions expressed are subject to change without notice and do not constitute financial, legal, or tax advice. Please consult your financial professional before executing any financial strategy. Investment advisory services offered through Alpha Star Capital Management, LLC, a registered investment advisor. Alpha Star and ILG Financial, LLC are independent entities. SEC registration does not constitute an endorsement of the firm by the Commission, nor does it indicate that the advisor has attained a particular level of skill or ability.